In this video, we're going to talk about some of the cautions that you have to be very aware of when producing data, and then at the end, why it's important not to introduce bias when you are producing data. So some of the cautions we have are under coverage. You want to make sure that all the groups in the population are included. Non-response. If somebody that's chosen for the sample can't be contacted or refuses to cooperate, that's a non-response. You have too much of that and it'll bias your sample. Response bias. The behavior of the respondent or the interviewer can lead to inaccurate answers. Or the wording of questions, where confusing or leading questions with bias, words with different meanings, different things like that, and the wording of questions can introduce bias into the answers. Non-response comes in a situation like this. We talked earlier about Sherry Height in her book Women and Love, how she sent out questionnaires to 100,000 women, but only 4.5% responded. That's 4,500 responses out of 100,000. And she used those responses to write her book. The problem is with the non-response being so high there, and realizing that the angrier women were more likely to respond, the information that she reported in her book was very biased by that non-response. Response bias comes in when respondents give answers that they think might be socially acceptable, wanting to please the person conducting the survey. Something like a survey on drug use. People are more likely to give socially acceptable answers if it's a door-to-door survey, especially if it's somebody like a police officer. So those kinds of questions are often better done in an anonymous survey situation so that people are more likely to be much more truthful. This is a funny one. In 1978, there was a poll done in Cincinnati that asked people whether they favored or opposed repealing the 1975 Public Affairs Act. Problem is, there was no such act. But about a third of those people asked expressed an opinion about it. So that really will tell you that if people are not informed about something but still willing to give opinions about it, that's going to give you biased responses. Wording of questions is extremely important. So there was a newsletter that was distributed by a politician to his constituents, which gave the results of a nationwide survey on Americans' attitude about a variety of educational issues. Then he asked the question, should your legislature adopt a policy to assist children in failing schools to opt out of that school and attend an alternative school, public, private, or parochial, of the parents' choosing? So the wording, think about it. You might want to pause the video and just think about it for a while and see what you come up with. From the wording, obviously the answer he desired was, yeah, they should be able to. He's really pushing that by his wording of the question. If he wanted to be non-biased in his wording of the question, he might say something like, do you think children should have options for schooling? And give the various options, public, private, or parochial. Deliberate bias can be put into a question. So a lot of these are just very unintentional. People just aren't paying attention, aren't having others read the questions to look for bias. But sometimes there's deliberate bias put in, like this one. These two questions. If you found a wallet with $20 in it, would you return the money? It's just a simple question. Or one with bias in it. If you found a wallet with $20 in it, would you do the right thing and return the money? So those were intentional bias, but unintentional bias can be when you use kind of vague words like few, because I've taught several, so few and several, people don't know what you mean by that. And over the past few days, how many servings of fruit have you eaten? You might not know how many days or even what constitutes a serving of fruit. Unnecessary complexity comes in when you ask really two questions in one. Like this one. Do you sometimes find that you have arguments with your family members and coworkers? It's two separate things, having arguments with family members and having arguments with coworkers. So somebody who does have arguments with one but not the other is going to have a hard time answering that question. The way questions are put in order is going to make a difference. Here, if you ask somebody how often they go out on a date, and then ask them, how happy are you with life? You're influencing that second question by creating this strong association between those two. So if somebody's reflecting on how often they date, if they're unhappy with how often they date, they're more likely to say they're unhappy with life in general. But if you just flip-flop those questions, so ask them how happy they are with life in general first, and then ask them how often they go out on a date, you don't create that strong association. So all of these cautions we talk about because when we take samples and produce data from those samples that we take, we're going to make conclusions, or what we call inferences, about the population based on those. Basically, the last half of this course will deal with inference and how we do inference in statistics. So we have to be careful that our information comes from simple random samples and comes from good data producing tools so that we can trust the data to make those inferences for the larger population. Now we also have to understand with all that there is variability. The different samples from the same population will yield very different or not very different, but can produce very different, but will produce slightly different, at least, results for a particular value of interest. You can take different samples and see that you get different information from them. So we need to look at what minimizes that variability. Random samples minimize that variability. Larger samples minimize that variability. And we can get at how close we are likely to be to the true values by something that's called a margin of error. So we will do that much more in depth as we move through this course.